So welcome to this class on economic pricing. So this is class 2 on economic pricing. In total we have 3 classes on the issues of economic pricing. In this class we'll see that economic pricing requires a classification of goods and services depending on their degree of international tradability, because this classification will affect in the end the choice about the pricing base that we'll adopt for determination of the accounting shadow price of the resource. And in particular, we'll see how traded goods are different from non-tradable and different from non-traded goods. So the outline of the class, consistently with these premises, organized as follows. First, we'll have a look at a possible pricing classification depending on the degree of international tradability of the goods and services. Second, we'll go into details of the border prices. In particular, we'll see how border prices are fixed. And then we'll see what are the criteria for the choice of the pricing models, above all for some specific categories of goods and services. In the sense that we'll see that there are some goods or services for which the pricing basis is objectively determined, and there are some other goods and services for which we have some degree of discretion, and therefore we can choose different pricing bases, and therefore we have to look at some criteria that we can adopt to make the choice between the one or the other. So let's start from the pricing classification. So as concerns the objective of this class, pricing classification can be defined as follows. In particular, I can find traded goods, tradable goods, non-tradable goods, and non-traded goods. What is the meaning of these 4 categories? So the traded goods are those goods and services that are actually traded in foreign markets. So these goods are exported and imported, so there is, in this case, an export or an import price that we can use as basis for pricing. Tradable goods are goods that at the moment are not traded on the financial market, so at the moment they are only marketed at domestic level, but they could be traded. In the sense that the fact that they are not traded is not related to their nature, as instead happens for non-tradable goods, but it's related to the existing of some government policy that at the moment does not allow trading of these goods, and therefore even though they could be potentially exportable or importable, at the moment they have not traded on foreign markets. So the problem here is how to treat from a pricing point of view these goods that are not traded but could be traded in absence of a policy that does not allow trading of these goods. So non-tradable goods are goods that not only are not traded but are not even tradable, and this is mainly for economic reasons. The reason why they are not traded on financial markets is because given the local production price and the international transportation cost, the import or the export will not be convenient. So what basically will happen in the case of imports, we could have a good that is a production cost in the country of origin that is lower than the domestic price of the same good. But once that I add the international transportation cost to the production cost, I get a total cost that is higher than the domestic price. So clearly, importing these goods will not be convenient for the local system. The same is true for the export. We could have a good that is a domestic price that is lower than the export price. But it could happen that international transportation costs increase this price beyond the export price, not making this good and convenient anymore for foreign countries. So in all these cases, the fact that the good is not traded does not depend on governmental policy, but depends on the nature of the good itself. And so this good not only is non-tradable, but it's also non-tradable. And finally, we have non-traded goods that at the moment are not traded. We don't know if they could be traded. So in this case, they could be treated either as tradable or non-tradable, depending on their nature. So the difference between tradable and non-traded is that tradable goods have been, for example, exported or imported in the past. So we know that this is possible. Non-traded goods are goods that have never been exposed to international trade, so we don't know if at this moment they could be traded in presence of government policy that allow international trade for these goods. So we'll see in this class that the classification of a good into one of these categories is critical for the choice of the pricing basis. So let's start from the traded goods. Traded goods are, as we said, the goods that are exported or imported, so that are exposed to trade in foreign countries. Here, however, we have a broader definition of traded goods that has to do also with the so-called effect of import substitution or export diversion. Because it could happen that the traded good is not exported, but an increased production of this good generates more exports or fewer imports. So in this particular case, I could refer to an input that is not imported, but if I increase the production of this input locally, this means that either I would be able to export a greater quantity of the output, or imports fewer inputs, lower quantity of this input. So even though this is not traded, it's like it was traded because it is a direct impact of export and imports of these goods. So in this case, it will be the case to treat the good as it was traded on a foreign market. And this effect is called import substitution, the fact that I have fewer imports. On the other side, I could have a good that, if it's increased in consumption, generates more imports or fewer exports. So the fact that more imports are generated means that the higher consumption will require to buy more of these goods from foreign countries. So the goods is traded on the market, but it's also could happen that I have an export diversion effect. That means that if I'm using more of this input within the local production, I will be able to export less of this input for foreign markets. For example, if the country produces coal, and coal is used more in local production, this will mean that given the total production of coal in the country will be able to export less coal to foreign countries. So now let's pass from traded goods to tradable goods. In particular, let's initially focus on tradable outputs. Here we can recognize three types of tradable outputs that are exportable goods, importable goods, and non-traded goods. So let's remember that these outputs are not traded in foreign markets because of restriction imposed by government policies, but given their nature, they could be exported or imported. So differently from the previous case, the nature of these goods is creating some problems in the choice of the appropriate pricing base. Because what we said for traded goods is that because they are currently traded, the only logic pricing bases are presented by the border price. However, here we talking about goods that are not traded in foreign markets, but could be traded. So the problem is, should I consider the domestic price, or should I consider the border price? So the domestic price is the price that is currently applied because they are marketed only in the local market, but as they are exportable or importable, in theory I could also refer to the border price. So let's look at two different situations that have the exportable outputs and importable outputs. What do we mean for exportable output? We mean products that have been produced in the country and could be either exported to another country, to a foreign country, or consumed locally. As at the moment the trading at the foreign markets is not allowed for this good, for this output, this means that at the current moment the output is priced on the basis of domestic price. It's what the consumer pay for that. So it's basically priced on the basis of the willingness to pay of the local consumers. However, it could happen that the export price could be higher than the domestic price. So in this case, the question could be, should I consider the border price, in particular the export price, or the domestic price? Clearly, if the export price is lower than domestic price, the problem does not exist, because the only references are represented by the domestic price, because it will not be convenient to export this product, and this product will be a non-tradable good. So the problem is not when export price is lower than domestic price, but when the export price is higher, because the domestic price that is currently applied to this good could undervalue the true economic value of this product. Because in theory, when the government poses a constraint on the trade of these goods on a foreign market, and the export price is higher than domestic price, there is a cost for the country as a whole that is determined by the difference between the higher export price and the lower local price. So when I have a non-tradable output with a constraint on the foreign trade, and the export price is higher than the domestic price, I have a gain for the consumer, because the consumer is paying the goods at a lower price than the price at which the good will be sold on foreign markets. So there is a gain for the consumer. But there is a loss for the project or the national income, because if the products were exported instead of consumed locally, the revenues will be higher for both the project and for the national income. So here I have a loss of national income that is determined by the constraint on trade. So here the problem is, do we refer to the current price that reflects an advantage for consumers, or we should consider the higher export price as an opportunity cost for the project or the country as a whole? And this is a problem that exists for the pricing of exportable outputs when export price is higher than domestic price, and that we'll go back to this choice in the last part of this class. So let's now consider the situation of importable outputs. So what are importable outputs? Importable outputs are products that at the moment are produced locally, but that could be imported at different prices. The only reason why they're not imported is because there is a constraint set by the government to the import of this specific good. And here again we have the problem of choosing among the border price and the current market price, because it could happen that the import price is lower than the current domestic price. If clearly the import price is higher than the current domestic price, well, there is no problem, because the import will not be convenient, and so we will have again a non-tradable good. But let's consider the case that is more problematic, when the import price is lower than the domestic price. And let's assume, so what would happen if there were not a constraint on the import of these goods? Well, it could happen that the consumer could buy this good at a lower price than the actual domestic price, so they would have a gain. Whereas the project would have a loss because of will sell the product at a lower price. So again, we have the problem of choosing between both the prices and domestic prices in the meaning of willingness to pay your production cost. And we have the same problem for importable goods as we had for exportable goods. When we refer to non-traded goods, clearly we refer to those non-traded goods that are non-traded because of government policies, but that could be traded if some constraints were released. So we are not talking about non-tradable goods. So in this case, non-traded outputs will be treated in the same fashion as tradable outputs. So now let's look at the tradable inputs. So we have again a tradable goods, but this time it's not an output of a project, but it's a resource that is used potentially as an input of a project. Also in this case, we could have an exportable input, an importable input, or we could have a non-traded input. And again, the fact that I have exportable inputs and importable inputs creates a problem for determining the appropriate pricing basis. Let's see why. So let's consider a case where an input is exportable. So this means that the input can either use it locally as an input for a local project, or if not used by a local project, could be exported. Now the problem is the export price of the input is higher than the domestic price of the input, what will happen? It will happen that in this case the project will generate an opportunity cost, because it's true that it will have access to an input at a lower cost, but it's also true that the economy as a whole is suffering an opportunity cost, because if it decides to open the foreign trade for this input, it could get a higher price from export. And clearly the difference between the export price and the domestic price represent a loss for the economy as a whole. So if we take this perspective and we don't take local perspective, we should consider the export price also for tradable inputs as an opportunity cost. So in theory, the appropriate price for the tradable and exportable input will be the higher between the export price and domestic price. Let's instead consider the case of an importable input. So we are talking about an input that is produced locally and used locally for a project, that is not imported at the moment for government policy that at the moment do not allow the trade of this input. So the problem is if the price of the import of this input is lower than the domestic price of the input, that is the price that I will pay locally for the project. So in this case, should I consider the import price or the domestic price as a correct pricing basis for this input? Well, again, this depends on whether I take a local or international market perspective. But what matters here to remark is that when you have the possibility of importing an input at a lower price as compared to the domestic price, and you don't do that for reasons related to the constraints on trade, you are suffering an opportunity cost, because if trade of this input was allowed, you could import this input and pay a lower cost for this input. So again, we should consider, if we take a global international perspective, that the correct price for this input is the import price, if lower than the domestic price, because once that the constraint is released, then the project could pay an import price for this specific input. And as concerns non-traded inputs, the logic is the same as for non-traded outputs. So if these are non-traded for policy and regulation reasons, these are treated as exportable or importable inputs. If these are non-traded for economic reasons, then they are considered the same way as the non-tradable inputs. So now let's look at non-tradable outputs and non-tradable inputs. So far we have seen traded inputs and outputs, and we have seen that in these cases we can apply the border prices. It's the only acceptable pricing basis. Then we have analyzing tradable and inputs and outputs, and we have seen that here we have a problem of choosing between domestic price and border price. Now we have the last category of relevant inputs and outputs, that is the non-tradable inputs and outputs. In particular, we start from non-tradable outputs. And here we distinguish between three cases that are natural non-tradables, not traded due to restrictions, infrastructure services. So natural non-tradables are those outputs that cannot be exported for the reasons we were mentioning before, because the international transport costs are too high and would bring the total price for export beyond the level of export price that now is applied on foreign markets. So these are natural non-tradables. The fact that they are not traded does not depend on internal policies or regulation. And so in this case, the only applicable pricing basis is a domestic price, and then according to the case, it will be willingness to pay or production costs. Then we have those outputs that are not traded due to restrictions, so potentially tradable, but anyhow here we are assuming that the restriction will not change, so in the end they are non-tradable assets. And the pricing basis again will be a domestic basis, but depending on the effect that non-trade is on the economy, we'll decide which basis of domestic pricing we'll adopt. In particular, the fact that an output is not traded due to restriction can have two effects on the economy. It could generate additional consumption, so if the asset is not, if the output is not traded on foreign markets, there is higher availability for internal consumption, or it could replace other alternative productions. So in the first case, the appropriate pricing basis is the willingness to pay of the consumer for this good. In the case of the replacement of other production, the appropriate basis is the production cost calculated in economic values. And finally, we have the infrastructure services. These are not traded for clearly logistic reasons. So typically, infrastructure have benefits for local population. So the services coming from infrastructures, given their technical nature, cannot be traded on foreign markets. So here again, the only basis for determination of the price is the domestic price. Okay, so now we have non-tradable inputs. And again, we could have natural non-tradables and other non-tradables. Natural non-tradables are those inputs that cannot be traded given their economic nature. And in particular, it could happen that I have some inputs that are traded on foreign markets with an import price that is lower than domestic markets, but it requires an international transportation cost that when added up to the import price generates a total price that is higher than the domestic price. So in this case, there is no convenience in importing these inputs, and so these inputs will only acquired on internal domestic market, and therefore the only pricing basis is the domestic price. Other non-tradables refers to situations where the inputs are not imported because of restriction that will not be removed in the future. And again, here there is no particular problem. The only basis for pricing is domestic price. Okay, so now let's look in more detail at border prices that have been mentioned so often in the last slides. So let's try to understand better our border price discernment. As I was anticipating in the previous class, a border price can be both export price and import price. Export price are also defined as FOB price, that is for free on board prices, that includes all the costs of delivery in the foreign country. Import price are also defined as CIF, that stands for cost, insurance, and freight. So again, we have the total cost of the import, including the related cost for insurance and transportation. And here there is some additional remark that is related to internal cost. So in particular, when I evaluate a border price, I have to compare the situation where I export or import the good with the situation where I consume or produce the goods locally. So what happens if I consume or I produce an input that then is sold in local markets? Most likely there will not be in charges for inland transportation. So for example, from the industrial site to the port. Instead, when I have export, I have to transport the good from the industrial site or the mine or from the place where it's produced to the port for international shipping. And then, if in case of import, I have to transport the good from the port to the industrial site or the local market where this is exchanged. So this inland transportation could be not needed in case of local production and consumption. So when I consider exports and imports, internal costs have to be appropriately considered in the calculation of the border price. And in order to make this clearer, I have two examples here, very simple example. One is in case of coal exports, that in particular is a situation of export diversion. Or the second example is on cement, and we have a case of import substitution. So the idea here is that the country is producing coal. The coal can be used both for in production for a project, and so it's an input for a project, or can be exported to a foreign market. Assuming very simply that the industrial site is close to the mine where the coal is extracted, in case of use by the project in the domestic context, the coal does not require inland transportation. Whereas if I decide to extract the coal and then export that to a foreign market, I have to transport the coal from the mine to the port. So in this case, it's true that if the export price is higher than the domestic price, it's true that when I export, I have an opportunity cost. So if I don't export, I have an opportunity cost because I am foregoing the possibility of exporting, so I am foregoing the higher price. So again, I could apply an opportunity cost that is equal to the potential export price. But in doing that, I should also consider that if I export, I would incur an additional internal cost for inland transportation that at this point should be subtracted if I apply this method correctly from the potential export cost. So in this export price. So in this case, the opportunity cost that I would use as economic value of this input will be the export price minus the internal cost for inland transportation. Let's take instead a case of import substitution. I need cement as an input for production. I can decide whether either to import cement from a foreign market or to produce cement at local level. So I could have an import price and a domestic price. The difference is that if I produce cement and use cement in local construction industry, I will not have to transport the cement, whereas if I import the cement, I should transport the cement from the port to the place where I will have the construction. So this implies that the internal cost for transportation is to be considered in the determination of the import price. So let's assume that the import price is lower than domestic price. So importing the cement will create an advantage clearly for the economy. If the cement is not imported, I will have anyhow an opportunity cost. So in this case, the pricing basis is the border price represented by the import price in the form of CIF. However, we have to consider here that if I import and not produce locally, I will have to pay an additional internal cost for inland transportation from the port to the construction site. And so the appropriate price will not only be the import price comprehensive of international freight and assurance, but I should also add the internal cost for internal transportation. So this would increase the eventual economic value of the resource. So at this point we can deal with the last topic of this class, that is the selection of the pricing model, that discusses which criteria we should use in the cases that pose more problems for the choice of the appropriate pricing basis. And in particular, this is the case of the tradable goods and non-traded goods. Whereas we know that there is no problem for the traded goods that are priced at the border price because they are currently traded on foreign markets, so we have export and import price. And we have no problem also for the non-tradable goods because these goods are not tradable anyhow, even though the policies will change, and this means that the only pricing basis will be the domestic price in the form of the willingness to pay the consumer or the production costs. So the two cases that create problems are tradable goods and non-traded goods. So we say that tradable goods are goods that are not traded at the moment but will be exported or imported in the absence of trade barriers. And non-traded goods are very similar case because at the moment they are not traded because government policy precludes trade. So again, if these trades were removed, probably these goods could be traded. Difference between tradable and non-traded is that tradable are proven, have already been traded, so it's proven that they can be traded, whereas non-traded goods have never been traded, but we know that at the moment there is some constraint on their trading, and we guess that if the constraint was not there, these goods could be exported. So from the point of view of the accounting pricing, we had a similar situation. So should we take the border price, that is the export or import price that represent the opportunity cost for this good, or should we refer to the domestic price, that is the price at which these goods are currently traded? So it's the current price, an objective price. Well, we already recognized that when you have more favorable conditions in export and in the import price, and you don't trade these goods in foreign markets, the export or the import price become opportunity cost, and so they become the basis for pricing, even though the goods is not traded. So the only fact that the goods will be tradable in absence of constraints can represent the justification to use the border price as pricing basis. But the other opinion is that at the moment the good is not traded, so the only reference for pricing is the domestic price. Moreover, as we've seen, the fact that domestic price is different from export price can create benefits for the consumers, even though it creates a loss for the economy as a whole. So if I'm more concerned about consumer, I could avoid referring to the border price. So let's say that from a theoretical and methodological point of view, when you have tradable and non-traded goods, you could choose both border price and domestic price. And in the end, the decision will depend again on what we define as pricing framework. In the sense that if the pricing framework is more oriented towards international markets and there's a global perspective, the border price are the only relevant prices for tradable and non-traded goods. So in other words, when you adopt international market perspective, you are recognizing that the current policies for trading of the country are inefficient, and therefore they are creating losses for the country, and there is an opportunity cost that is represented by border price that is the only relevant basis for the pricing of this good. On the contrary, you could have a pricing framework that is more concentrated on the local issues, in particular on the society benefits. So you could be more concentrated on what happens in your country. So you could be more concerned about the welfare of the consumers. So the fact that consumers are paying less for goods that are available on the local market and not exported could be a relevant objective for a national policy maker. So in this case, this logic suggests the use of domestic price as basis for pricing. So it really depends on the perspective you have. And if you have a local you have a local policy pricing framework, clearly the pricing framework is fixed, it will not be changed in the future. So the non-tradable goods, the tradable goods become by definition non-tradable goods, because you imagine that the constraint on the foreign trading will persist in the future, so there is no way that you can trade this good on the foreign market. And so if you make this further assumption, the tradable become non-tradable, and as we've seen for non-tradable goods, the only basis for pricing is the domestic price. Therefore, in these particular cases, we'll have to decide based on the pricing framework. So just to summarize at the end of the class, if we have traded goods, the basis price is the border price. If we have non-tradable goods, the basis price is domestic price. If we have tradable or non-traded goods, where non-traded means that these goods could be traded if government policy change, you could choose between border price and domestic price. They could be both admissible, but the final choice will depend on your perspective, in particular on the pricing framework. If you have a pricing framework that is more oriented towards international markets, you will choose a border price. If you are adopting a pricing framework that is more oriented toward the local society and the current developing policies, then your choice will be the domestic price. Oh, we have finished this class, and I thank you for your attention. And I remind you, as usual, that if you need further materials on this class, you can refer to the course website. Thank you.